cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Thank you. In Hawaiian culture and folklore, rain is seen as a sign of favor and blessing because the earth and the people who inhabit it cannot exist without its abundance. So good afternoon, my sisters and brothers. My name is Father Manuel Williams. How wonderful it is that our gracious Creator has called us all together in these days to celebrate, to commemorate, to memorialize, to energize, and to recommit our hearts and our hands to doing the deeds of justice. For the last 28 years, it has been my joy and privilege to serve as pastor and mission director of Resurrection Catholic Missions here in Montgomery. And as a servant leader, it has been my awesome responsibility to call that community of faith to be a community of service, a community forming disciples in both personal and social holiness. In an age when the great monotheistic faiths are challenged by theologies that can only best be described as deviant, which seek to turn the values of justice and fairness, equality and compassion on their heads, we need now, as much as ever, believers and people of goodwill who will speak truth to power, who will proclaim a word of life, a word of righteousness, of freedom and dignity and equality of persons and opportunities for every human being. Sisters and brothers, we are privileged today to have in our presence a champion of the values of the kingdom. He is a scholar. He is a pastor. He is a political activist. He is a practical and an academic theologian. He is a speaker of truth, and dare I say it, he is a prophet of peace and justice. Holding degrees in political science from North Carolina Central University, degree in divinity from Duke University, and a doctorate in public policy and pastoral care from Drew University, our speaker has led a powerful movement of Moral Mondays challenging repressive and racialized policies of North Carolina, and that movement serves as a catalyst and a model for the resistance across our country. He is an awardee of the highest honors presented by his state, by the NAACP, by numerous other service and advocacy organizations and institutions of higher learning. Reverend Dr. William Barber has emerged as a powerful, poetic, strategic advocate for the building of the beloved community. In his second book, The Third Reconstruction, Dr. Barber notes that for years he heard people in his native places saying that they were going to go hope somebody. Some of you recognize that phrase. The use of hope rather than the use of the word help. He writes in the book that later he came to understand and to realize that this was not a grammatical error, but rather it was an endemic theological statement, because that is the task of every believer, the task of every person of goodwill, to hope, to give hope by doing acts of justice. And so, brothers and sisters, it is my distinct honor to present to you a servant of God who in his ministry helps to give us all hope so that we can make this earthly city more closely resemble the heavenly city that so many of us say we aspire to. Reverend Dr. William Barber.
hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Oh, hold on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming real soon. Oh, pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Oh, pray on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming real soon. Oh, fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. Oh, fight on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming real soon. Children, we gotta stand on a little while longer. Plant your feet and stand on just a little while longer. Oh, stand on just a little while longer. 'Cause I know justice is coming real soon. Ooh, I know justice is coming real soon. Yes, I know justice is coming real soon.
It's against the common good. And what we need to be asking of all of our leaders when all of these policies is not, is it the left position or the right position, but is it constitutionally consistent? Is it morally defensible? And is it economically sane? Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but Teddy Roosevelt wanted universal health care. Teddy Roosevelt wanted a minimum wage. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to protect the environment. Teddy Roosevelt supported public education. Teddy Roosevelt said we need to get our money out of politics. Teddy Roosevelt supported raising the minimum wage. What we have in this country is extremism that has hijacked parties. We have a heart problem. We can't give up on the heart of our democracy. Not now, not ever. Moral dissenters must stand up again today, not just in our sanctuaries of safety, but we must carry the sanctuary into the public square. Hallelujah! Find the glory. Revive us again.
When you see certain legislators who are pushing headlong to pass.
Hello. Thank you so much. Gracious and eternal God, we thank you for the way over which you have brought us. We know whenever you ask any human being to do anything in your name for the cause of justice and love, you take the risk of putting
treasure in trash, treasure in an earthen vessel, that the excellency of the power might be of thee and not of us. Hold us and hide us, keep us and use us. Come, Holy Spirit, come. Amen. I am beyond humbled to have the opportunity to share at this opening of this museum, this critical moment in history, Fire and Ryan Stevens, and just thank God for even that you all would consider a country boy from a little place called Free Union. And I know part of the reason they invited me was kind of like the man who put his mule, is that Mike down there? His mule in the Kentucky Derby. And he paid a $10,000 entry fee. And the mule was swayback. And somebody looked at him and said, well, why would you do that? You know he's not going to win. And he said, well, I know he's not going to win, but maybe the exposure will do him some good. There's a certain solemnness standing here today and just leaving Arizona, meeting with the Apache nations that are joining in with the Poor People's Campaign and others. There's a quietness in my spirit as I think about those containers of dirt. And I want to talk a little bit today about memorializing those who were lynched then and building a movement against lynching now. There is this reality that exists in the annals of American history called lynching. Not hanging, we never should call it hanging, but lynching. Not capital punishment, Scott. Lynching. Black people, men and women and children were lynched, not hung. The goal of lynching was always to instill fear. Lynching was a tool of the powerful racists who believed that any access to power and freedom by black people and any coalition of black and white working and poor people that could transform the South had to be stopped. Because it is true, it was true then, it's true now. You change the South, you change the nation. They saw any coalition as a threat to the power and the livelihood that the white racist aristocracy had in the South and its control over the nation. Now, Dr. King, when he marched with others from Selma to Montgomery on the steps of the Alabama State House, gave what I think is probably his most powerful speech, second only to the one about Vietnam that most people never even quote from. And in that speech, he spent about 15 minutes at the end of that march talking about the intentional way in which white racist aristocracy in the South always sought to divide black and white power anytime there was the possibility of a white-black unity among poor whites and poor blacks that could in fact shift the political demographics. He talked about it in such a way, you ought to read it, because if you read it, then you will understand what Neil Painter has said, and that is that the current resident of the White House is the iconography of a very common American experience. The last election is not the first time we've seen racism and division being used to hijack the American political system. Dr. King spent time almost in a professorial mode on the steps of the Capitol talking about this. He also laid out that lynching was a part of a whole set of tools, Brother Gore, it was scapegoating was used, and tax cuts were always used, and undermining voter suppression or undermine voting rights were always used to undermine any effort that might bring black and white people together in the South. And lynching was a key cornerstone of the fear. And this was done even in the Bible Belt, where so many people put their hand on the Bible but don't know what's in it. Where so many people, some of my so-called Christian evangelicals, I have trouble with that because I'm an evangelical, who say so much about what God says so little and so little about what God says so much. Because the Word of God actually says something about lynching. In Proverbs 6, it says, "These are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination." Doesn't say anything about being gay. Doesn't say God hates gay folk. Doesn't say anything about abortion. Doesn't say anything. But it does say God hates a haughty eyes, proud look, looking down on people. God hates a lying tongue. And God hates hands that shed innocent blood. W.B. Du Bois wrote about this crisis, and he noted that constitutionally, we don't have any amendment to the Constitution or any part of its original writing that outlawed lynching. Think about that. Now, we do have in the Constitution an amendment that was put in to guarantee slave patrols and white militias could have guns. That's called the Second Amendment. And it's so sad now that an amendment that was put in the Constitution to allow slave patrols to kill black folk is now being used in a way that's killing all of our children. There's no constitutional provision against lynching in the Constitution, none. W.B. Du Bois, talking about lynching, said, "The recent horrible lynchings in the United States, even the almost incredible burning of human beings alive, have raised not a ripple of interest, not a single protest from the United States government, scarcely a word from the pulpit, and not a syllable of horror or suggestion from the defenders of the Republic, the 100% Americans, or the propagandists of the Army and the Navy." This is Du Bois talking about lynching, which is why he named that little magazine The Crisis. And it wasn't until 1920 that the first piece of federal legislation was proposed. And interestingly enough, the legislator that proposed it was Leonidas Dyer from Ferguson. And after he proposed it, he was voted down and voted out. Ida B. Wells declared, "I'd rather go down in history as one lone Negro who dared to tell the government that it had done a dastardly thing in lynching than to save my skin by taking back what I said." Billie Holiday sang, "Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh, the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is the fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop." A white brother, after reading Dr. James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, said this. He said, "I felt grief for the nearly 5,000 African-American men and women and children who were lynched between 1830 and 1940, and anger that during the 60-year Holocaust of lynching, hardly any white preachers, evangelists, and theologians noticed it." He said, Cone says in his book, Jesus was lynched. He makes the connection between the crucifixion of Jesus and the lynching of African Americans. He explains why understanding that connection is vital to understanding the meaning of the cross. He says Jesus was an innocent victim of mob hysteria and the Roman imperial violence, because the only people that were crucified were revolutionaries, those that dared to stand up to Caesar. Rome didn't lynch Jesus because he was going to save people from their sin. Rome lynched Jesus because Jesus challenged Rome's sin, the sin of injustice. Then Cone says both the cross and the lynching tree were symbols of terror, instruments of torture and execution reserved primarily for insurrectionists. Both Jesus and blacks were publicly humiliated, subjected to the utmost indignity and cruelty. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that there weren't others who were lynched. There were. But the overwhelming group of folk that were lynched in this country were black men and women and children. And the purpose was to strike terror. That's why we never say of those that were lynched, they were hung. Hung is to suggest it was legal. Hung suggested it was, I still would disagree with it as a form of capital punishment, but lynching is terror. It was to let people know that the same thing would happen to them if they didn't stay in their place. All of these statements remind us that lynching was political. It's political murder. Its goal was to terrorize the political aspirations of African Americans and their coalitions with black and other people, white and brown. It was prescribed. There's no accident that it was prescribed to shut down black people, and particularly leaders that would stand up. It was purposeful. It was meant to depress political power and dehumanize people of African descent. One writer put it like this: lynching is the practice of murder by extrajudicial action. He said lynching in America rose in number after the American Civil War in the late 1800s. It followed the emancipation of the slaves. And the message was, for everybody swinging, white supremacy rules, and blacks must be kept in a state of powerlessness. You know, lynchings were photographed. They were published on postcards. They were used as souvenirs. Victims were killed by mobs, shot, hanged, burned. And according to the Tuskegee Institute, 3,446 African Americans from 1880 to the 1960s, and those are the ones we know of. Some were lynched and their bodies were buried deep in the mud of southern swamps. A 2017 paper found that more racially segregated counties were more likely to experience lynching. It also shows that blacks were lynched, particularly in counties where they presented economic competition, such as independent black farmers and businessmen and women. They were sometimes lynched or they suffered the destruction of their property or both. There's history that whites sometimes lynched blacks for financial gain and sometimes to establish political or economic dominance. These lynchings emphasize a new social order. In fact, these lynchings were a part of a movement that sounds religious, but it is deeply irreligious. It was called the Redemption Movement. And the goal of the Redemption Movement was to redeem America from the power and possibility of black and white people working together. Lynchings were done to create a sense of collective identity among whites as the unequal social roles of whites and blacks were enforced. In much of the Deep South, lynchings peaked in the late 19th century and the 20th century as racists turned to terrorism, particularly to dissuade blacks from voting. One writer also says that lynching had a seasonal pattern. For instance, in the Mississippi Delta, lynchings were more frequent at the end of the year when sharecroppers and tenant farmers tried to settle their accounts. In the 1890s, African-American journalist and anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Well conducted one of the first thorough investigations. And while we often talk about rape, the false accusation of rape, which was one of the accusations used, rape, false accusation of murder, she says lynchings were used whenever there was a false accusation that included verbal and physical aggression. Some of the same stuff you hear cops today say when they justify why they shot an unarmed. Oh, spirited business competition was a reason for lynching. And here's one: we're lynching this person because of their independence of mind. This is in the record. They were so arrogant that they would write this stuff down. After the Civil War, nearly 4 million slaves were emancipated in the South. And what the problem with that was, many of them constituted a majority in states. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866 by former Confederate veterans in Tennessee, and it became associated with insurgent violence against freedmen and their allies, and lynching was the tool of choice. As early as 1867, 1868, and the goal of the lynching was to prevent the ratification of new constitutions that were written during the time of Reconstruction. And the opposition used all kinds of ways to harass voters, but lynching was the thing that was done to try to scare any person, African American, from working on reconstructing the Constitution and to drive fear in the hearts of white people. In other words, if you stay with them, this is what's going to happen to you too. In the 1868, there was an election, 1868, and there were the murders of 1,300 voters across southern states, from South Carolina to Alabama, in 1868, lynching. Then there was the Enforcement Act of 1870 and the Civil Rights Act of 1871. And then you had the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that made it a federal law to violate civil rights. But most of these laws by the 1880s were nullified. That's why Dr. King said 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. He was saying, America, I thought we fixed this. And then there was the Mississippi Plan that spread to Alabama and other places. And the Mississippi Plan used hate and used lynching and used voter intimidation to control the election of 1876. The Mississippi Plan used informal and armed militias to assassinate political leaders, hunt down community members, intimidate and turn away voters, and suggested if we don't stop these black folk from voting, they're going to murder, they're going to rape. You heard that language before, recently? And that plan ushered in a president who lost the popular vote. But was selected by the Electoral College, 1877. And that president, upon being selected, promised to pull the troops out of the South, to turn the courts over to the extremists, to turn the Supreme Court over to the extremists, and to roll back voting laws. And it was all because of the fear of the changing demographics, particularly in the South. That's why you can never say that some of what we're seeing now is the worst thing we've ever seen. Some of what we're seeing now is nothing but a regurgitation of the vomit of racism that we have seen before. It's not just a threat to black people, it's a threat to our democracy itself. And so, my brothers and sisters, the dirt from all these sites where lynchings have occurred in Alabama in this museum now represent in a strange way holy ground. Holy ground where there was a holy war waged for justice that left many soldiers swinging in the wind. But the story of that dirt also testifies that there is still a power and a possibility for people to keep fighting and keep striving, even in the face of terror and in the face of lynching. I want us for just before I finish, just take a few seconds and stand and pay homage to all of those that kept fighting even after they saw the bodies swinging in front of them. Come on. All of those past, all of those that died and gone on, but they never quit. They never stopped. All of the white folk, all of the black folk that still stayed together. The ancestors. And before you sit down, I want you to turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, if they kept fighting in the face of lynch mobs, I dare you to be scared of Trump. I dare you to be scared. I dare you. 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 I dare you to be afraid of modern day white nationalists. They must not know who we are. We are the sons and the daughters of those that kept on anyhow. Now, we have to remember the remembrance of these deaths by lynching that were designed by the politics of racism, fear, and injustice. We have to remember. But the remembrance also forces us to raise some questions in our day. Number one, is lynching still occurring? Number two, is there lynching that must be challenged morally, legally, and politically? And number three, can we memorialize the lynching of the past without building a movement against the lynching of today? And I would say no. I would say to come here and memorialize the lynching of the past and not address and build a movement against modern day forms of political lynching today would in fact be hypocritical. Lynching today? Oh yes. There are all kinds of things swinging in the air. Remember I said that the lynchings were politically motivated. It wasn't just about physical bodies. When the Voting Rights Act that was designed to protect the rights of all people, and African Americans in particular, has been gutted to the point that for over 1,800 days, the Ryan McConnell Congress has refused to restore the Voting Rights Act since June 25th, 2013, before Trump. And it has unleashed the kind of voter suppression we haven't seen since Jim Crow. 23 states have passed voter suppression laws, and the people that get elected through voter suppression end up hurting mostly white people. That's the connection. Every state that has voter suppression, the people that use voter suppression get elected, but once they get elected, they pass policies that hurt everybody, but mostly white people. The same states that do voter suppression are anti-gay, anti-immigrants, anti-living wages, anti-health care, anti-environmental justice, You can track it. If you just know that a state engaged in voter suppression, you can almost follow that that state has elected people who are extremely regressive. Extremely regressive. And they control the poorest states. That's a form of political lynching, in my mind. When more than 31% of Alabamians are blocked from their access to voting, we are seeing a form of modern day political lynching. When we continue to tie a noose around certain gerrymandered districts that allow people to cheat their way into office rather than win legitimate offices, that's a form of political lynching. When there are more than 140 million people living in poverty, as we were planning the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, one of the things we've said is we've got to change our narrative. We keep hearing people say there are 40 million people in poverty. No, there are 140 million people who are poor or working poor or who could not make it with some kind of supplement. That's 43.5% of a nation that is the wealthiest nation in the world, 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. And when we know, according to one study by the Mailman School of Public Health and other studies, that upwards of 200,000 people die every year from low wealth. Now remember, hear that number. Yes, we should be horrified and angry that 5,000 people were lynched from the 1860s to the 1940s, but today, 250,000 people die every year from low wealth. That's more than die from heart attacks, strokes, and cancer. Yes, we should be in the street when one African American or two or three are shot, unarmed African Americans are shot by police. Yes, we should be in the street when there are people dying in these schools and there are persons that are more willing to protect guns than they are to protect children. But if we should be in the state over the streets, over 5,000 people that were lynched in yesteryear and over others who are being killed today by guns, surely if 250,000 people are dying, we ought to call that modern day political lynching. People that are dying, not because it's their time to go, not because God called them home, but because systems that choke the life out of them. There are 37 million people that are not insured even with the Affordable Care Act. And one Harvard study said for every 1 million people uninsured, 5,600 people die. Do the math, 5,600 times 37. That's how many people will die this year. And a group of clergy that I work with said, we're going to stop lying. If anybody dies from the lack of health insurance, we're not going to stand over them and say that God called them home. We will say God may welcome them home, but that God didn't call them home. We're going to do like Mamie Till and open the caskets and point and say, this is what government policy lynching looks like. It's time to put a face on the ugliness. It's time to put a face on the ugliness of political violence. I want you to remember this name, Venus. Venus is the name of a young girl who died in her mother's arms because Alabama refused to expand Medicaid. The governor and the legislature refused because of their dislike for a black man in the White House. They refused. Even though when they refused it, the majority of the people in Alabama that didn't get the health care are white. But they racialized. That's one of the reasons I thought that when they were promoting the Affordable Care Act, people should have come south. And they should have brought black and white people together. Because there's a video out there where a guy's saying, I don't agree with Obamacare. And then they say, well, what kind of health care do you have? Well, I have the Affordable Care Act, but I don't believe with that. I agree with Reverend Jackson. We should have never allowed them to name it Obamacare. We shouldn't have agreed with it because that was a trick. It's racialized code word. It caused people to vote against their own issue. It is the Southern strategy being played out over again where you don't sound like a racist, but you use a dog whistle. And the problem with a dog whistle is the dogs can hear it. Thousands of people dying without health care in the richest nation in the world, the only nation of the 25 wealthiest nations that do not offer some form of universal health care. I don't care what you call that. That's a form of modern day political lynching. having more than 4 million children, not just in Flint, but all over this country, that are exposed to lead in their water. 4 million. You can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. Even when your city sits right beside the biggest freshwater reservoir in the entire country. And right here in Montgomery, if you go over to Loudoun County, 20 miles from the Edmonds-Pettus Bridge or less, some 35% of the population, they have parasites in their water. And while we're in this nice plush place with sewage, you can go 20 miles from here and find people who have raw sewage running in their backyards where children play. And the government systems ran the sewage up to where the businesses were, but would not run it right across the street where the people were. Call it what you want. That's a form of modern day political lynching. And when we spend more than $500 billion a year on the war economy, more money to almost double what we spend in Vietnam, and militarism, and we drop illegal bombs on black and brown countries and Muslim countries whose citizenry are already suffering from extreme politics of our time. That is a form of political lynching. Dr. King said any country that is constantly driven by its military decisions is a country headed towards spiritual death. And then when you have this false moral narrative that will justify this stuff, will say, well, the only thing we ought to be talking about is being against gay people, being against abortion, being for prayer in the schools, being for tax cuts, and being for gun rights. And if you do that, Jesus loves you. This I know. And they ignore the 2,500 scriptures in the Bible that say a moral agenda has to do with how you treat the poor, how you treat the stranger, how you treat the least of these, how you treat the broken. And when they then will go into to a White House meeting with other Congress people and lay hands and pray, P-R-A-Y, for a president and others, while that president and others are praying, P-R-E-Y-I-N-G, on the poorest and the broken among us, that is an attempt to lynch the real moral agenda so that a hypocritical agenda can go forth. It must be challenged. I cannot come here today and remember the lynching that those jars of dirt represent without asking the question, must we not call out modern day lynching? And so, this is why we believe it is critical now to have a poor people's campaign, a national call for moral revival that challenges 5 interlocking injustices that are trying to strangle the life out of our democracy. Systemic racism, not interpersonal relations, but systemic racism, like voter suppression and refusing to give our immigrants justice. When really they didn't come across the border, we went across the border and took their stuff. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. And Islamophobia and xenophobia, the racism, and the disgusting way that we still treat the First Nation, indigenous people. Number 2, we must address systemic poverty. You cannot survive as a democracy when 43% of your people are struggling in poverty. Then we must address ecological devastation. And then we must address the war economy and militarism. And then we must address the false narrative of so-called religious nationalism that seeks to consecrate injustice rather than challenge it, where forces claim to be the chaplains of the state rather than the critic of the state. And these are 5 interlocking injustices that don't just threaten black people, don't just threaten white people, don't just threaten red people and yellow people and brown. They threaten to strangle, to literally lynch the life out of our democracy. And we must build a massive, nonviolent confrontation to policies of racism, militarism, classism, ecological devastation, and theological malpractice. Not violence, for we are against lynching. But we must have a movement that will loosen the rope and remove it from around the neck of our democracy. We must expose how these policies are literally trying to choke out the life, choke out the possibility of what this nation can become. They're trying to stop a third Reconstruction. They're trying to stop black and white and brown people from coming together in the South and restructure. Do you know what do you know in the 13 southern states there are 170, almost 180 electoral votes? And do you know right now we exist in a time where if you registered 30% of the unregistered black voters in the South and connected them with progressive white and brown people, that you could change 4 or 5 southern states almost immediately? And do you know that if you did that, you change the politics of this nation? And do you know parties are not going to do it because they're still trying to find a secret weapon or something magical, or they talk about we got to go get white working class voters, which is wrong because that's racist in itself, because they're also black working class voters and brown working class voters. It's going to take a movement of people who will come together and change the politics and change the narrative and rise up from the South, not again, but for the first time in a major way, coming together. We must have an anti-violence movement, but we must describe violence as more than just what happens with gun violence. I met the other day with students who were in that movement, and they're coming into the Poor People's Campaign because they understand now the connection between those who protect the gun owners and those who suppress the vote, right? But Coretta Scott King helped us when Coretta Scott King was asked one time about violence, and she said, violence is more than someone shooting my husband through the neck and severing his spine. She says, violence is ghetto housing. Violence is refusing to pay people a living wage. Violence is denying people public education. Violence is messing up the environment. Violence is destroying people's culture. Violence is denying people health care. And then Sister Coretta said, and there's another form of violence, and that is an apathetic attitude that refuses to challenge the other forms of violence. Oh, God. And so, I come by to announce that on Mother's Day, from Mother's Day to June 23rd, we are announcing 40 days of nonviolent, moral, direct fusion action in 30 states and the District of Columbia. And it's with poor people, not for them, not paternalistically for, but with them. And clergy conspicuously, imams and rabbis and Christian clergy and others, and people who may not be people of faith, but they believe in the constitutional morality such as establishing justice and ensuring domestic tranquility and providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare. We're going to reclaim welfare as a good political word. And we're launching this movement. It's not an end. The 40 days is not an end. It's not even a commemoration of what happened 50 years ago. It's the launching of a multi-year movement that is designed to work on the soul and the heart of this democracy. And we have sense enough to know before you can change the agenda, you've got to be in the narrative. And so the goal of this movement are people who are going to put their bodies and their minds on the line to shift the narrative in this country. We had 26 presidential election debates in 2016, not 1 hour on voting rights, not 1 hour on poverty, not 1 hour on ecological devastation, not 1 hour on the way in which militarism hurts the forward movement of our democracy. We cannot have a political debate where we talk more about emails and tweets and porn stars than we do the real issues that are affecting the people of this nation. We need a movement. We need a movement. So I want you to go to poorpeoplescampaign.org. I want you to go to breachrepairers.org. For 40 days, We're going to engage in nonviolent moral fusion direct action, not just in D.C., but all over the country, or wave in front of state houses and in District of Columbia. And we're not going to the places they tell us. You can stand over there and protest. We're going to declare the Capitol is our house. The street in front of the Capitol are our house. And we're going to have to launch 40 days and beyond of massive voter mobilization and then power building among the poor. I wonder what it would look like if we could get some of that 140 million people to see themselves together. I wonder if we could get women like I was with last week up in eastern Kentucky. I met with the Hatfields and the McCoys. You know that's a miracle. I had the Hatfields and the McCoys in the same room. Now what if we can hook them up with black women from Alabama and they come together? They come together. I'm headed out this week to the Harbor in Washington, where the largest population of white millennial homeless people live. Graves Harbor. Met a young girl out there. She came to one of our meetings. She said, y'all, I want to tell y'all, I'm a redneck. I said, oh, Lord, this is going somewhere. She said, I'm a redneck. She said, but I'm more than that. She said, I'm the white trash that America threw out but forgot to burn, and I'm joining the Poor People's Campaign because it's time. It's time for us to get together. So I'm inviting you to join. I'm inviting you to hook up. I'm inviting you to join us for one of the Mondays, the 6 Mondays, where we'll engage in simultaneous, nonviolent, moral, direct action to break through the tweets and to break through the noise and to put a face on poverty and racism and ecological devastation, to put a face on it, to go after the narrative and the consciousness, because in order to change the narrative, you got to change the narrator. And then when you change the narrator, you can change the agenda, but you can't do anything until you own the agenda. And we have in the book of Amos, God told Amos, look, if I can get a remnant, Amos chapter 5, he said, if I can get a remnant of people who are hurting, that were willing to close down the factories and close down the schools and get into public square. This is in the Bible, long before Dr. King, long before anybody. He said, God said, if I can get a remnant, and if I can get a remnant that will cry and lament and will make the nation see the pain of his doing. God said, if you'll do that, then I'll visit you. I'll give you power. I'll help you. And so, my friends, I answer my own question. We must demand life and not lynching. Policies of life and death, we must demand them. We must do it together. We must demand a living wage. We must demand not only the restoration of the Voting Rights Act, but automatic registration at 18 and early voting and same-day registration. We must demand protection of our environmental system. We must demand health care for all people. How dare a politician get elected and get free health care, and then you don't want the people that elected you to have the same thing you got? We must, and there's much more on the agenda, we must do it together. You see, lynchings were carried out by mobs, but lynchings were stopped by movements. Ida B. Wells built a movement. Leonidas Dyer from Ferguson, Missouri, led a movement. W.B. Du Bois announced a crisis that birthed a movement to stop lynching. We today must be a life-giving movement that stands up to the mobs of political extremism who often under the Gentile ways of parliamentary procedure engage in the ugly plans of political lynching. And this is our day. That's all it is. This is not the worst we've ever seen. It's just our time. Others have stood before, but they're dead and gone. I declare unto you, Harriet Tubman's not getting up out of the grave. I declare unto you, William Lord Garrison is not getting up out of the grave. I declare unto you, A. Philip Randolph is not getting up out of the grave. I declare unto you that Rabbi Heschel and Dorothy Day are not getting up out of the grave. I visited the crypt and Martin Luther King called his name and he didn't get out of the grave. But America needs to know this. They may not get out of the grave, but we are their children. And we will never turn back on this democracy. And we will never allow lynching to choke the life out of this democracy. It's time for a movement for life.